Okay, so chapter 13 of the Leviathan, probably the most famous in the book, certainly contains some of the most famous lines in the book, and we'll talk about chapter 13 and a little bit about chapter 14. We won't get into chapter 14 in great detail, but we will talk about the way that Hobbes kind of resolves the problem that he presents in chapter 13 and how he basically originates the idea of the social contract. But just to sort of spell out something that was at the end of the last lecture, at the end when Hobbes says reasons that the Roman Church has lost its power and focuses especially in all of their has lost its power as a religion and has lost people's belief and has led to the rise of something like the Reformation, and Hobbes focuses on the way that the Roman Church has claimed power over political sovereigns and so on. The implication is a true religion would not do this, that it's so obvious that the Roman Church benefits itself by claiming power over the sovereigns of various countries, saying that ultimately the political, secular sovereign has to be subservient to the church. Hobbes, what he's clearly saying is that so obviously is just to the benefit of the Roman Church that people see it as an obvious power grab. And then again, the further implication, true religion, true religion would not do that. A true religion would not try to assert the power of the religious authority over the civil authority, to use the terms that he's used elsewhere in the book. So anyways, going on to chapter 13. So Hobbes starts chapter 13 by saying human beings are all basically equal. So this thing that we're very obviously today, we've all heard we're all familiar with the idea of equality. It's a very powerful moral idea today. People believe in equality. It's obviously in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights. And Hobbes characteristically talks about that, but does not have nearly as sort of uplifting or really in any way as moral a view of what that actually means. Now, what he means, first of all, is he says basically people are basically equal in both body and mind. And he says obviously that's not entirely true. Some people are stronger than others, some people are faster, some people are smarter, but he says, but everybody is basically equal enough that everybody is equally vulnerable to being attacked in some way by everyone else. You may be very strong, but someone else can get a weapon and kill you, or they can band up with, they can join up with others who are similarly threatened by you, and they can, 5 against 1, they can attack you and kill you, they can wait for you to fall asleep. Hobbes says, no one is so powerful that they can actually overcome everybody physically or mentally or intellectually. No one is so much smarter than everybody else that they can imagine every possible trap and figure everything out and protect themselves against all the possible enemies they might have in a state of nature, for instance, where there is no law. So Hobbes says, and here he's talking about basically just being equally vulnerable to being killed, but behind this, again, is his rejection of the idea of a summum bonum. When he says there is no greatest good for human life, then in a sense, it follows from that therefore in a very fundamental way, people are all equal. If there is a greatest good, if there is a sort of ultimate purpose for human life, like Aquinas said, for instance, some people will be better at pursuing that than others. And therefore there will be a very important kind of natural inequality between people who are, if part of this good consists in virtue, some people will be more virtuous than others. And therefore that natural inequality will be very important. Whereas Hobbes, when he rejects the idea that there is any ultimate purpose for human life, any greatest good at which human life aims necessarily, then they're basically, for one thing, all ends then become equal. So the fact that one person wants to pursue physical pleasure and another person wants to devote themselves to cultivating intellectual virtue, those ultimately are just those are equal human beings for Hobbes, because again, it's not that one understands the true meaning of life and is pursuing that and the other one isn't. They just have different goals. And again, it's not as if one of them is pursuing it better or is more virtuous or is better at doing what human beings should be doing as human beings. There is no thing that human beings should be doing as human beings. There is no goal, no greatest good at which they should be aiming. So the idea of these sorts of inequalities, which were very important in ancient and medieval political thought, sort of disappear here for Hobbes. Because if there is no ultimate, again, if there is no greatest good, no ultimate goal at which human life aims, then people are not better or worse at pursuing that. If there is no set of virtues that make human beings attain this end better, then differences in virtue are ultimately secondary to the fact that everybody is basically equal, because again, there's no inequality based on how well people realize their innate human potential to realize a particular goal for life, which is just built into the structure of human nature. So if there isn't any of that, then people are equal in a very fundamental way. So first of all, we can just sort of, Hobbes doesn't really spell this out, but for Hobbes, we can, clear away the idea that there are important natural, moral or intellectual inequalities that mean that, again, some people are more virtuous than others. Hobbes says, well, there is no ultimate standard for virtue, therefore none of that matters. There is no inequality in that way, in a way that would actually matter. It might matter for somebody in their own image of themselves, but it doesn't matter for politics, and it doesn't matter for understanding human nature as it really is. So he says, people are basically equal in that way because there is no ultimate good. Therefore, you can't create a hierarchy or say that there's a natural hierarchy based on how well people are pursuing that ultimate good. And then he says, and also then ultimately what is left, to a large extent what's left is simple survival, the basic physical imperative of self-preservation, that sort of lowest good that Aquinas recognized in his discussion of natural law. Or you could also see it as if there is no ultimate good, if there is no ultimate good at which everything aims, there is an ultimate evil, violent death, which everybody agrees that they want to avoid. So the orientation becomes no longer positive. It's no longer trying to attain the greatest good, the ultimate good that all human beings seek. It's trying to just avoid the ultimate evil that all human beings can agree is horrifying, and that is again painful, violent death. But so in any case, so in this situation that he's describing, then all human beings are equal, and again, ultimately, what he means is they're equally vulnerable to being killed by each other. No one is so strong that they're invulnerable. No one is so smart that they can figure out everything that might happen and protect themselves from every possible threat. So he says this equality, this basic equality, and again, he has a sort of funny, typically Hobbesian bit of psychological insight saying, of course, everybody thinks that they're smarter than everybody else, but it's not true, and he has reasons showing why he doesn't think that that's true. But basically, no one is actually that smart that they can actually figure out every possible threat and avoid it or neutralize it. So he says, given that people are basically equal, they have equal hope of getting what they want. And therefore, conflict is inevitable. If someone really were so much stronger than everyone else that they could simply, smash them and never actually be threatened by them physically, then no one would attack that person. They would realize this person is invulnerable. If they were Superman and no one knew about kryptonite and Superman came and just took whatever he wanted, no one would really try to challenge him because they would realize soon enough you can't do anything. He really is so unequal compared to everybody else that there's really nothing we can do to stop him. If someone really were so clever that they could sort of figure everything out and it became clear that there's nothing you can do against this person, then there wouldn't be conflict with that person because people would realize we can't win. But it's not that way. Everybody is basically equal, and therefore Hobbes says everyone has a basically equal hope of getting what they want. Therefore, when there's conflict between people, when two people want the same thing, let's just say in the state of nature, the same apple, two people are hungry, they see an apple, they both want it, they fight over it. And Hobbes says, and they'll fight so far that they'll actually destroy each other. Even though they start worrying about their own preservation, and that's the cause of conflict, the conflict will go so far that they'll actually destroy each other over this conflict that began over self-preservation. And so Hobbes says, in the state of nature where there's no common power to overawe everybody, he says it's actually quite bad. People, it's destruction, violent death, all of these things are quite common. As he puts it, chapter 13, section 5, again, men have no pleasure, but on the contrary, a great deal of grief in keeping company where there is no power able to overawe them all. For every man looketh that his companion should value him at the same rate he sets upon himself, and upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing naturally endeavors as far as he dares, which amongst them that have no common power to keep them in quiet is far enough to make them destroy each other, to extort a greater value from his contemners by damage, and from the others by the example. So here he focuses on not just the fact that the people compete over things, or not just that they might attack simply out of fear, that somebody might attack somebody else simply because they think that person is a threat to them or could be. Here he focuses on the idea that people, as he says, wants everybody to set the same value on themselves that they set on themselves. Everybody else wants to be rated as highly by other people as they are by themselves, which is, of course is impossible, because according to Hobbes, we all think that we're the most important person in the world. And we all demand that everybody else recognize that we're the most important person in the world. But of course, everybody else thinks that they're the most important person in the world. So Hobbes says there will be all kinds of signs of conflict where people simply fight over what he calls glory, over reputation, over respect, over people will attack and kill each other because they feel somehow insulted. And so Hobbes says, without some common power to keep people quiet, to overawe them, and to make them obey the laws, people very quickly will destroy each other. And he says there are three basic causes of conflict in the state of nature. He says competition, diffidence, and glory. Competition, again, fighting over resources, over food, over water, over land maybe. Diffidence is simply fear that someone else might be a threat. So you might attack and kill somebody or enslave them, any number of things, simply because you think that they're a threat. And even, again, if it comes to maybe you kill them and take something, or you attack them and enslave them because you're worried about somebody else. You're not even worried about this person, but you're worried about somebody else that you saw out there killing somebody else. So Hobbes says, there are all kinds of things that you would very reasonably, and with justice, or he ultimately says justice doesn't exist in the state of nature, but he says it would be perfectly reasonable and okay for somebody to do these things in the state of nature because they fear other people. So you can do almost anything, you're justified in doing almost anything that you need to in the state of nature just on the basis of fear. Not even because you're necessarily threatened by somebody else, but just because you might fear that someone else might be a threat. You might harm somebody else because you're worried about a threat from a third person. So he says there are these things, and then he says, and then ultimately there's glory, and he says this. He's very contemptuous of this. He says glory makes people attack for trifles, as a word, a smile, a different opinion, and any other sign of undervalue, either direct in their persons or by reflection in their kindred, their friends, their nation, their profession, or their name. So he says, if they themselves are somehow undervalued or insulted in some way, or anything they identify enough with, their family, their friends, their nation, their profession, they hear somebody say something about their profession that they don't like, and they get angry and they want to attack this person for not being respectful enough of them, which is ultimately what it comes down to. It's not that they really care about the honor of their profession, or they know so many good people who are working hard to do the right thing in their profession. They feel personally insulted and offended, and therefore they want to attack the other person. And as he puts it, sort of extort, as he puts it there in chapter or in section 5 that we read, to extort a greater value from his contemners, from those who are treating him with contempt, by damage. So first of all, you extract greater honor by damaging, by hurting somebody, and then making them see, and then from others by the example. So you extract the value by harming the person who has insulted you, and then others see that, and then then they say, well, watch out for that guy, and then they start to treat you with more deference and respect and so on, which is the goal. So Hobbes says, all of these conflicts in the state of nature that are all rooted in human nature. And he goes on and he says, basically, this is what the state of nature is. It's a state of war. And he says, and that doesn't mean that people are constantly fighting all the time. He says, but overall, the disposition is one of war. Just like in an actual war, people aren't constantly shooting at each other. But until there's actual peace, there's a war going on. He says, like if we say the weather has been rainy, we don't necessarily mean that for the past week. We don't necessarily mean that it's rained every second of the past week. But overall, it's either been raining or the skies have been overcast. It's looked like it could start raining at any moment. He says there's an overall disposition for something to happen. He says, and that's what war is, and that's what the state of nature is like. And he says, in that state of nature, he says, basically, as he'll say here, and again at the end of the chapter, there is no right and wrong. As he puts it at the end of the chapter, force and fraud are the two cardinal virtues in a time of war. Force and fraud, violence and lying. He says basically nothing can really be wrong. But he says basically that people would just go and do anything they have to, and therefore it will become this terrible situation in which there's nothing. There's no industry, there's no security, there's nothing. And then the famous line, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Probably one of the most famous lines in the history of philosophy. It appeared even in a Tom Waits song. So then he goes on, and so he says, that's the picture of the state of nature, and it's terrible, and everybody would want to avoid it and get out as much as possible. And then he goes on, he says, it may seem strange to some man that has not well weighed these things, that nature should thus dissociate and render man apt to invade and destroy one another. So he says, it might seem strange to someone who hasn't really thought about it that nature would dissociate people, rather than bringing them together, rather than making them cooperate, rather than making them part of some sort of community or something. Instead, it would dissociate them, tear them apart, and make them attack and invade each other. And so they may say, that's not true. That's not the way that human nature is. And Hobbes says, so let him look at himself. And he says, when he travels, he carries a weapon because they were highwaymen, and even today, people carry guns in their car and so on. People, obviously in Oklahoma, people carry guns. There's concealed and now there's open carry. So people carry guns with them in public because they feel threatened by other people. He says when they're at home, they lock their door, obviously to keep other people out, and even in their house, he says they lock their chests. So he says, so what opinion are they showing of other people when they ride armed, even though they know there are laws and policemen and so on? When they lock their door, even though, again, they know there are laws, they know there are police to come and prosecute people who break in? And what opinion do they show of their children and their servants when they lock things up in their own house? Because do these people not accuse man more? Does someone who acts like this not accuse man more by his actions than I do by my words? So here we have, again, Hobbes, the very sort of shrewd, insightful moralist, exposing hypocrisy, saying, look, people may not want to accept this. People may not like the idea that people are violent and aggressive and want to kill each other. And they may not say, well, that's not what people are naturally like. But Hobbes says, look at the way that you actually act. Look at how you actually expect other people to act. And you'll see that you're actually, you may not want to accept the implications of the real meaning of that, but you'll see if you look at your own actions and then the precautions that you yourself take against other people, you'll see that you believe the same thing. But he says, so he says, does he not accuse other men as much by his actions as I do by my words? But he says, but neither of us accuse human nature in it. As he says at the end of this section, he says, but neither of us accuse man's nature in it. The desires and other passions of man are in themselves no sin. So the desire, even the desire to murder, he says, by itself is no sin. Again, obviously not an orthodox Christian view. No more are the actions that proceed from those passions, till even the actions. So murder, robbery, all of these things are not sin. He's saying till they know a law that forbids them, which till laws be made they cannot know. Nor can any law be made till they have agreed upon the person that shall make it. So basically, again, he's saying before society, before laws are created, nothing is right or wrong. Nothing that a person wants, nothing that a person desires, even to kill people because he feels disrespected by them. Hobbes says that's not wrong until there's a law to actually say that it's wrong. And as he puts it, the laws can't be made until they've agreed upon the person that shall make it. And here we have it sort of clearly pointing towards the idea of the social contract, people agreeing, creating a sovereign who will create these laws. He says, people may say they were never this way. He uses the example of civil war. He says, again, look at what happens in a country during a time of civil war when the actual government collapses, and look at how people act. Again, they don't just come together and say, let's rebuild everything. They kill each other. Sometimes for years, it just goes on. So Hobbes says, look, that's what I'm talking about. That's the state of nature. Now, we'll see Rousseau says, no, that's not the state of nature. That's what society has done to people. And then when a common power disappears, sure, then they go out and they act this way. But that's not because that's their nature. That's because that's what society has made them. And he says, Rousseau was saying none of this is actually natural. All of this is actually the product of society. But anyways, Hobbes right here saying, look, this is the way people are. You can see this. Look at what happens in a time of civil war. And then he says, as he puts it in section 13 of chapter 13, to this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent that nothing can be unjust. So in this war, nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. And he says, justice and injustice cannot, as he puts it, justice and injustice are none of the faculties, neither of the body nor mind. If they were, they might be in a man that were alone in the world, as well as his senses and passions. But he says they are qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. So he says, basically, again, that in this state of nature, in this war of all against all, nothing can be wrong. In fact, the two cardinal virtues are force and fraud. Things that would ordinarily be considered wrong are, in fact, the virtues, the things that enable you to survive and possibly even, if not quite win, because no one really wins, to at least survive for a little bit longer. He says justice and injustice, they don't exist in the person, only in society. And that's because you need law. Now, obviously, somebody might say when Hobbes uses the example of someone alone in the world, can they be just or unjust? Someone might say, well, No, because justice does require other people, as does injustice, but that doesn't mean that it's not an inherent part of human nature. It just means that you need other people to be just. But Hobbes, we've sort of seen his view. Until there's law, until there's some sort of rule established, nothing is right or wrong, nothing is just or unjust, nothing is sinful, as he puts it at one point. There's just human nature wanting what it wants and doing whatever it can to get that. But it's an awful situation that human nature creates for itself. But he says, so these at the end of the chapter 13, he says this is the condition that human nature creates for itself. But he says there's also, even though human nature creates this and human passions create this situation, the same passions also sort of in the same human nature sort of shows a way out of it. Reason suggests the ability to make covenants and contracts and so on to get out of it, and the passions also want to get out of it, because as much as people might be maniacs and as much as they may want to go around and attack anybody who they don't like or who they don't think is respecting them enough, they also realize that this actually isn't very good and that no one is going to survive or do very well in the state of nature, and they see if only we had peace, things could be so much better. So he says that's the way out. The human reason and the passions suggest a way out of the state of nature, and suggest, first of all, how you could get out, and secondly, suggest why you would want to get out. So basically, again, we won't discuss all of chapter 14 where he discusses contracts, but we will discuss a little bit here at the beginning. So he says, the right of nature, as he puts it at the very beginning, the right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturae, is the liberty each man hath to use his own power, as he will himself, for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which, in his own judgment and reason, he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. So he says the right of nature is basically the right that people have to preserve themselves and to do anything that they think is necessary to preserve themselves. And again, we've seen in chapter 13, he says, you may kill somebody who has not threatened you at all just because they might threaten you. They might frighten you in some way. So he says, that's the right of nature, is to do whatever you think is necessary to protect yourself. He goes on, he says, a law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or taketh away the means of preserving the same, and to omit that by which he thinketh it may be best preserved. So a law of nature is basically a command to preserve your own life, or to not to do something that might harm your life. So basically the law of nature is about self-preservation. Again, we remember from Aquinas, natural law for him, yes, the first basic good that human beings seek is self-preservation, but then there were all of them, the various other goods. Ultimately, seeking the truth about God, living in society. We'll see what Hobbes says about the law of nature. Right here we see self-preservation is really the only sort of content for the law of nature. What is the law of nature? That you should preserve yourself and do whatever is necessary to do that, but also not to omit things that might help you preserve your life. And so we see where he's going with this, basically. The right of nature is your right to do whatever you think is necessary to preserve yourself. The law of nature says you must do things to preserve yourself, and ultimately that will mean that if you can get out of the state of nature, you are obliged by the natural law to do so, because that will always help you preserve yourself. That will always be better. So he says, again, a law of nature is a precept or a general rule found out by reason, so reason kind of tells us how to do it, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life. Of course, he might mean smoking or something, but even more, he might mean staying in the state of nature, doing things that will harm the law and therefore threaten society and therefore lead people back to the state of nature, or at least increase the likelihood that will happen. Or taketh away the means of preserving the same, and to omit that by which he thinketh it may best be preserved. He says you can't do any of that. You have to do. You're morally obliged by the natural law to preserve yourself and to preserve your life in the best way you can think of. And so he goes on and develops this to some extent and says, consequently, it is a precept or general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. So and then he goes on, he says there are two parts here. First of all, seek peace. The second, by any means we can to defend ourselves. So basically the first law of nature is, the fundamental law of nature is to seek peace, because it very quickly, reason tells you you're not going to succeed in the state of nature. Even if you do for a little while, you will ultimately die. You will ultimately die a very unpleasant, violent death. And so he says, reason tells you seek peace. That's the first law of nature, is to seek peace. However, if it's not reasonable to think you can seek peace, if peace is not an actual option, then the fundamental law of nature says, by all means you can defend yourself. Do whatever you think you need to actually defend yourself against the threats to your life. So how does that work then? He says, goes on and says, from this fundamental law of nature by which men are commanded to endeavor peace is derived this second law, that a man be willing, when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself he shall think it necessary, to lay down this right to all things, this natural right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. And here we have the basic idea, and Hobbes is the first person to really suggest this and really argue for it, the basic idea of the social contract, the basic idea that society is not about natural political human beings being by nature political, as Aristotle said, as Aquinas said. It's not about a natural political impulse in people. It's not about, again, what Aquinas would say, the natural law. People want to live in society because there's a distinctly human good that comes from living in society. It's not just self-preservation. There are particular virtues that human beings can only really cultivate and practice in society, and therefore human beings should live in society. Natural law tells them that, but it's about more than simply peace. It's about more than simply protecting themselves. And that was the old view of politics. Here Hobbes basically says, politics, why do people join political society? To protect themselves, for purely selfish reasons. There's no natural sense of kinship. There's no natural partnership for some common good. Again, we've seen Hobbes says there might be a common good in the sense of common protection, but there is no common, higher good that all people are pursuing, in which maybe they need other people to help them pursue. Again, we've already seen Hobbes rejects all of that. Instead, what there is the common good of self-preservation, and therefore the natural law says whenever other people are willing to, you need to lay down your natural right to all things, limit yourself in the same way as other people are willing to limit themselves, and therefore create peace. Create a situation of peace in which all of you have given up some of your rights to a certain extent, and therefore in which you're no longer in the state of war. All of you, by giving up some of your rights, have created a situation in which everybody, by laying down their rights, have created a relatively stable, relatively peaceful society, which protects everybody. So again, social contract here, the idea that, again, politics is basically about selfish individuals contracting, making an actual contract with clearly spelled out expectations and duties and so on, to end the state of nature. So again, selfish individuals coming together, making this contract, and again, what is it? What is natural law? What is natural right here? People have the natural right to do whatever they think is necessary to defend themselves in the state of nature, but Hobbes says there's also a natural law, a natural obligation that all people have, that reason tells them to seek peace whenever they can, and if they can't seek peace, or if they can't achieve peace, do whatever is necessary to defend themselves. But then he says the second law of nature, which follows from the first, is when other people are willing to lay down some of their rights and create a society which will create peace and create laws which will bind people together and make them secure and so on, you have an obligation to do that. You can't say, I think I'm better off in the state of nature. That's going against the law of nature. So everybody, when others are willing to, everybody has an actual obligation from the state of nature to lay down their own rights and to join society, again, ultimately to seek peace. So that's, Hobbes' view of the state of nature, how terrible it is, how it's basically based, how it's rooted in human nature, but how there's also a sort of something that's also rooted in human nature, though in many ways more difficult to sort of bring out or develop or build upon, but also rooted in human nature is a desire for peace, and therefore a means to sort of get out of the state of nature, to create society, to create peace by following these laws of nature, which again, as we've seen, Hobbes understands very differently from Aquinas.